That's okay, thanks. This session that Chris is going to present to us discusses Intelligence Augmentation, IA, which is a framework for understanding how to combine the complementary strengths of human minds and AI's digital brain. So just a little bit about Dr. Dede. For 22 years, he was the Timothy Wirth Professor in Learning Technologies at HGSE, Graduate School of Education. His fundamental interest is in developing new types of educational systems to meet opportunities and challenges of the 21st century. His research spans emerging technologies for learning, infusing technology into large-scale educational improvement initiatives, developing policies that support educational transformation, and providing leadership in education innovation. He's currently a co-principal investigator of the NSF-funded National Intelligence Institute in Adult Learning and Online Education. And he also co-founded the Silver Lining for Learning initiative and developed a widely used framework for scaling up educational innovations. Currently, he's a senior research fellow and also the former chair of the Learning and Teaching program at HGSE, and is an advisor to the digital puppeteering company Mursion, which sounds really cool. So just a couple of acknowledgements. People online, we ask you, if you can, leave your, hi everyone, leave your cameras on. We will take questions at the end, but you can put them in the chat and then we'll get to them, or you can use the raise hand feature when we're finished. I also want to acknowledge Ting Ting Reed and Mursion Wu, our postdocs who helped chair the co-chair the seminar, and Wendy Berlin, who facilitates a lot of the things we do. So if everybody in the room can leave your sound, if you have a computer off, then we don't have an echo online. So welcome, Dr. Dede, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate the chance to share ideas and get feedback on them. I think the last time I was here for a similar talk was 5 or 6 years ago. At that point, I was describing some of the work I and my colleagues were doing with virtual worlds. And now here we are with AI, which is merging with XR in some interesting ways. A little bit of background about my knowledge of AI. When I was a graduate student over half a century ago, I read the very first scholarly paper on AI in education. This was in 1970. And the author confidently predicted that by the end of the 70s, we wouldn't need teachers anymore. This is a long-standing tradition in artificial intelligence. I've lived now through 9 hype cycles. About every 5 years, there's an AI hype cycle, and the optimists say that we're going to have digital deities, and the pessimists say that the Terminator is coming, and somehow neither one of those ever happens. But there is always an advance of some kind. And so I have, I think, a balanced and historical view of AI that stands me in good stead with all of the hype, because this cycle may have generated more hype than any of the others that I've lived through. And I'm going to try to explain why that might be true. So with that as a background, why are large language models, which is what generative AI is, large language models and models that are similar for other kinds of representation, why are they important? Well, for 3/4 of a century since the inception of artificial intelligence, people have been trying to solve the natural language processing problem, because we've all interacted with machines and have been very frustrated with the input. There's a forced choice that appears on the screen, none of which typically are things that you really want to do, or you have to learn a programming language to talk to the machine, or you have to use such a restricted vocabulary and syntax that it's really very frustrating. And the breakthrough with generative AI in terms of language is that it can respond appropriately when it's given a natural language input. Now, I'm saying that very carefully because I'm not saying it understands the input or it comprehends the input, or even that it responds to the semantics of the input. what I'm saying is that it recognizes patterns in the input. It looks inside of itself for similar patterns and patterns of response, and then it gives what it thinks is the best response statistically. So none of it involves any kind of comprehension or understanding. And this is something that I'll return to later, but it is able to respond appropriately. And so that opens up not only natural language interfaces for a lot of things that have been constrained because the input-output was so awkward and limited, and natural language-based research, because now you can process a huge amount of natural language data without doing it through labor-intensive methods. But it also opens up new classes of learning that I think are potentially very exciting. Nonetheless, I find that 90% of what I read about generative AI is relatively worthless, and that it's way overhyped in terms of what it can do. And one reason that's true is something called the ELIZA effect. Also, when I was a graduate student, Joseph Weizenbaum, who was an AI and natural language expert at MIT, developed a little program called ELIZA, which he named after Eliza Doolittle. And it was nothing but a bag of tricks. It was a whole set of cheats for processing inputs and returning statements that appeared to work, but that really had nothing at all behind it. And the way that he did this was he mimicked the Rogerian psychotherapist. Now, again, some of you old enough will remember Carl Rogers was a big name in psychotherapy around that time, and Rogerian therapy largely consisted of reflecting back to the patient what the patient was saying to you. So you'd come in and you'd say, I had a difficult day at work, and the therapist would say, I hear you saying that your work was really complex today. And you say, my boss is really a creep. And the therapist says, I hear you saying that your boss was part of why the day was hard. And every once in a while, Eliza would say, how do you feel about your mother? You know, something else. It's a little bit more like their random generation. And I wouldn't be telling you this story except for the fact that Weizenbaum was horrified by what happened when we released Eliza, because many people, including his own secretary, spent hours and hours and hours talking to Eliza, revealing their innermost secrets, and thinking that they were getting therapeutic advice back. And he wrote a whole book about this. The root cause, oversimplified, is that we are neurologically wired to listen to language and to regard language as important. So it's an evolutionary thing. If you're an infant, you want to have neurological wiring that if someone is talking to you, you pay attention and you look for meaning in that, and you assume, your brain assumes that it's worth doing, and your mind, as it develops, assumes that it involves some kind of understanding that's useful. So anything that produces language is rightly or wrongly seen as having intelligence behind it. Eliza didn't have intelligence behind it. And there's a kind of intelligence, sort of, that's behind generative AI, but it's not an intelligence that's like any kind of human intelligence. And in fact, it's very limited in terms of what it can do. So we'll return more to that and talk about that later. But there's a really good reason why people are excited, and there are not so good reasons why people are excited that all get jumbled up together. But what I want to begin with is something that I think is more important than AI in education, and that is IA, Intelligence Augmentation. And this is basically because the biggest impact of AI is probably going to be changing what the outcomes of education should be, rather than necessarily changing the process of education, even though it's going to be influential in doing both. So economists talk about the division of labor between people and machines, which parts of the job are done by machines, which parts are done by people. That's been changing for a very long time, ever since the agricultural revolution. And there's lots and lots of graphs and charts that show that over time, the amount of work, even intellectual work that's done by machines keeps going up, and the amount of work that's done by humans then necessarily diminishes. Companies like McKinsey and the other big accounting groups, former accounting groups, consulting groups, are busy churning out lots and lots of forecasts about how AI is going to affect the division of labor and how many, many types of roles are going to have an AI partner connected with them. Now, the track record of these forecasts, if you look at them historically, is actually not very good. That is, they're not necessarily very accurate forecasts in terms of what types of impact and how much impact. They are pretty accurate, though, about the existence of an impact of some kind. And you can see that there's a wide variety of things that groups like this are forecasting in terms of how much work is going to start to be done by some form of AI that's independent of a human being, and how that partnership might work. So it seems clear that this is going to happen. It's less clear from the predictions exactly what it's going to be. So what is this partnership? AI is good at reckoning. Human beings are good at judgment. Now, science fiction has wrestled with this for a very long time. In fact, most of the things that people are discussing, reinventing the wheel with, science fiction discussed a couple decades ago. Very creative place to look. And those of you who are fans of Star Trek: The Next Generation will recognize Captain Picard, the wise starship captain who uses human judgment, and Data, who looks like a person but is not. Data is a machine, an android, an AI, who is subordinate to the captain. And the two of them have a very nice IA relationship, because Data is capable of absorbing, as you would think from his name, his name. We anthropomorphize these things. Enormous amounts of information, and very, very quickly reckoning, making different kinds of forecasts and predictions. And Captain Picard then has to sort through this, use his human wisdom, applied wisdom, and decide what to do. But there's less fanciful examples that give an increased sense of what this might look like in practice. So many oncologists, cancer doctors, now have AI systems of different kinds. It's a fast-moving field, but the AI can do things that no human being can do. It can scan 1,500 medical journals online every morning to see if there are any possible advances that could affect the treatment of a particular patient. It can scan online medical records of different kinds, looking for other people who are being treated in other places of a similar condition with similar treatments, and getting some kind of estimates back. So it does all this reckoning and says to the doctor, here's what's new, in effect. But you would never want the AI counseling the patient, because the doctor, as a human being, has judgment about things that the AI cannot understand at all. Some people want quality of life, and other people want quantity of life. Pain is something that varies among people and how they handle pain. The concept of death and what that death means to each individual, the personal and cultural consequences for individuals and families of different kinds of choices about how to respond to a life and death situation, spiritual and ethical beliefs of different kinds that people have about mortality, and so on and so on. AI all those things are meaningless to AI. And the reason is essentially that there's three kinds of experience that generate knowledge that human beings have that AI does not. There's probably more, but this is, the vast version of this. So the fact that you're embodied, and you have a biological body, means that you have experienced and you know things. And what for you means eating healthy food is something that AI does not understand. It can look up things that talk about healthy food in general and feed things back to you, which, depending on whether you're lactose intolerant or not, or whether you're diabetic, may or may not be the appropriate things. AI has no social sense of social or cultural interaction. These are all examples of what a typical 5-year-old okay, a 5-year-old knew something about healthy food, something about having fun with your friends at the playground, something about crossing a busy street. Depending on whether or not you're in the British Isles, AI would give you the wrong advice about crossing the street, and you'd be picked up by a car because you'd be looking the wrong way. So there's all these kinds of human lived experience that make up, over time, applied wisdom, judgment, that AI not only can't do now, but I will argue later, won't be able to do in the foreseeable future. So the power here is that you're offloading reckoning, which people often don't do very well anyway, and getting more time to focus on judgment, which is often where the real power is in terms of the kinds of problem solving that people do in the workplace now. And an example of this comes out of the institute that I'm the associate director of research for. So the National Science Foundation currently is funding 25 national AI institutes. Each gets 5 years and $20 million, and is expected, as you know, from NSF to walk on water while they're in the process of spending that money. And they're often tied to a particular sector. So there's institutes that center on food, there's institutes that center on the elderly, and so on. There's 5 institutes that center on education right now, and 4 of them are pre-college. So we are the only one that is essentially workforce upskilling and reskilling, but it does extend down to kind of college and university a little bit in the sense of workforce prep and getting you ready for your first job. And our institute, and I'll talk about this more later, is building different kinds of AI assistants for people like me, university professors, who teach adults, or corporate trainers who teach adults, and so on. And there's content tutors that can help with content where the rest of the class got it, but some of the students didn't. There's question answering, teaching assistants, because nobody ever reads the directions, even though all that information is there. There's lab assistants, library assistants. There's even a social assistant that in a large online class can suggest to students, other students who might be good learning partners based on some algorithm about what makes up good learning partners. And so I'm going to be surrounded by these things. And I can either be de-skilled or upskilled depending on what I want to do. If I don't do anything, and I just say, oh, good, it's more time for research, I'm de-skilled in terms of teaching. And in fact, I end up kind of working for the AIs. The question answering one says, I don't know the answer to this one, you do it. But if I upskill, if I focus on the cultural characteristics of my students and the deeper philosophic and ethical implications of my content, or whatever comes out of that earlier menu, then the combination is more powerful. So that's the theory. But it only works if people upskill. And the problem we have is that one of our primary measures of quality in adult learning whether it's higher education, whether it's continuing education, whether it's workforce capacity building, is high-stakes psychometric tests. And those tests have their merit, but they are fundamentally reckoning. And that's why AI does really well on all forms of high-stakes psychometric tests. It's good at reckoning. So in a sense, by making our thermometer of quality reckoning-based, the more that that's true, the more we're preparing students to lose to AI, as opposed to preparing students for judgment. If you're saying, well, how might you measure judgment? Typically, you'll see some of this later, it's through performance. So you ask someone to deliver a complex performance, and then you judge how well that performance went. And the performance may draw on reckoning, but it has a lot of other elements beyond that. So I'm excited about IA. I mean, I think if we're actually able to achieve IA as a civilization, there's all sorts of interesting things that can happen, because both the reckoning is strengthened, because now you've got something doing it that's better at reckoning than we are. And the judgment is strengthened because now we've got more time and effort to put into judgment. So modeling for localized decisions. I think a lot of the problems with climate change are that people in Iowa read about California alternately burning down and being flooded, and they think, well, thank God I don't live in California. But if we could combine all of our databases, which AI is adept doing, and forecast sort of a low, a medium, and a high climate change index that's local, and say, here's the part that's likely to flood periodically in 2050, at the low end, at the high end, and at the intermediate end. All of a sudden, that takes on more meaning. A higher threshold for human creation. Suppose that you're painting and you're doing a wonderful creative painting, something that AI could not do because there's never been a painting like this before, so it can't look in its database and find that. And you have this wonderful little flower that you're crafting that's going to have a whole border of that flower around the painting. Well, now all you have to do is the first one. And then you say, you do the other 99. So it opens up an interesting kind of a threshold. AI, as an example of IA, is very good at descriptive writing. It doesn't understand narrative, because narratives that are compelling are social, they're cultural, they're ethical, they draw on all sorts of things that AI doesn't understand. So instead of teaching kids to write descriptively, it lets them extend in a narrative, which is far more powerful, and so on and so on. I'll talk more about increased understanding of the self later. So if you're interested in going deeper with this, colleagues and I did a report that's online from the Next Level Lab at HGSE that talks in more depth about IA and gives a lot of primary source citations for this. And you'll have the PowerPoint too. And then to bridge to where I'm going next, what does this mean for educators if we're going to do more judgment and less reckoning? A colleague and I did a report about suggestions for educators along these lines that's also available through the Next Level Lab. But I'll talk a little bit about what this more judgment, less reckoning might look like. So the first thing to say is that in learning, the journey itself is the destination. The destination isn't the destination. The journey is the destination. So whether it's a painting, whether it's a program, whether it's a piece of writing, the destination is the proxy, is an artifact that only has meaning if you took the journey to create the artifact. It's a proxy for the fact that you were able to produce it. And if some other person or some other thing produces the artifact, then you haven't had the journey. and you're not capable of producing it. And so when I read that people are saying, well, let's just have AI write something and then students can edit it, they're not learning to take their own, often hazy, original thoughts and structure them in a way that's comprehensible and compelling for other people. They're taking some stuff that comes out of a machine and tinkering with it. It's a completely different process. So a touchstone for AI in education in general is, if it's short-circuiting the journey, it's a bad idea. So what isn't a bad idea? Well, I mentioned this National Institute that I'm part of. Most of what they're building is expressed in this kind of an overview graph. They're building AI assistants for teachers and coaches, depending on whether you're doing presentational instruction or learning by doing with mentoring. They're building assistants for learners. At the back end, there's machine learning to make sense out of all the process data, and then it's feeding back into the teachers, coaches, and the students, learners. So for example, they developed a tool called SMART. SMART is a tool that asks learners to summarize a complicated concept. And then the tool gives them feedback on how well they did. So notice the tool is not producing the summary. The learner is producing the summary. The tool is providing feedback along multiple dimensions on how they did. There's a tool called Vera. Vera is about learning through simulation. So let's say that you have text simulations, or you have NetLogo, and you're generating models and trying to understand the phenomenon by generating models. Vera doesn't do the simulation, but Vera looks at the processes by which you're generating models and the trajectory that you're taking and using the models as a path to understanding, and provides feedback on that. So they're building a variety of tools like that. Closer to home, Professor Nicole Mills in the French department here teaches the Intro to French 1 and 2. She has long used immersive learning because language is primarily about culture and context. You understand the language best when you understand the culture and the context. And so she, for years, and I worked with her on some of this with others to bring in the kind of XR dimension. How do you make students feel as if they're in Paris and that they live in Paris and so on? Well, what she's been able to add with AI is chatbots that allow the performances to take place. So the one that they developed is, there's a famous surrealist museum in the Centre Pompidou in Paris. And there's been a murder committed in that surrealist museum. And you are the detective. You're like the French Columbo who has to show up and make sense of what's happened. And the whole rest of the simulation is populated with chatbots, each one of which has a specific role. Now, if you think about plays and movies, the lead role, you know, the role that's played by Leonardo DiCaprio or Meryl Streep, you can't get there with a chatbot. But the person that opens the hotel door and says good morning, right? The person who brings the coffee to the table, most of the narrative is carried by secondary actors, and chatbots can do secondary actors. And so there's the opportunity to learn more about French and France by solving this. This is hosted by a company called Wanda VR, which is French. And I and colleagues are working with them on a couple of things. We're working on teaching negotiation, in part by practicing with chatbots. We're working on teaching restaurant staff to handle people who are quite different than they are, who may speak a different language, who have a different socioeconomic level, and who are trying to order something. There's just a very wide variety of things where you can try to do things that involve human judgment, and use chatbots to do reckoning that enables you to teach judgment. I mentioned that there's 4 other national AI institutes that are all pre-college. The one that's been around the longest, ISAC, is, among other things, is building ways of helping teachers do project-based learning. So you do project-based learning, you've got 30 kids, you've got 10 groups of 3, you're wandering around trying to figure out who's stuck and how to help them. Very difficult to understand where each one is and where you should go next and what the problem is. They're building little devices that sit in each group, and they listen. They don't participate, but they listen. They can process natural language. And so when the teacher comes and says, what's going on, the device indicates to the teacher where it thinks the group is in the collaborative process and what it thinks the problem is. Now, that may or may not be accurate, but at least it's a start. And you can imagine these devices sending signals to something like the little tablet the teacher's carrying around that has a dashboard, and one group starts flashing red because that device is saying, you better get over here, there's a problem. So that's very interesting. You know, that's again a way not of trying to have the device do judgment, but have it do a kind of reckoning that's helpful to the person doing judgment. There's a group at North Carolina State that is doing story-based learning that's collaborative, and the stories respect the range of cultures within the class. And of course, for the classes now at every level, in any but the most constrained environment, there's an unbelievable range of cultures and languages. And so a story that's compelling to one culture can easily be boring or even offensive to another culture. How do you bridge this? That's a problem that they're working on. There's a group at U Buffalo that is all about students who have substantial learning difficulties, particularly in reading. And they're again applying AI as ways of processing data that then human beings can make skilled judgments about, sort of like a cancer doctor. There's a group at U Illinois Chicago that is about dispositions, basically. How do you build academic tenacity, academic resilience, creativity, things that we know are associated with success? And again, they're looking at ways that AI can do this. So if these are of interest to you, this is your tax dollars at work. For the institute I work with or the other 4, I would certainly urge you to stay up with what they're doing, to inform what they're doing, and so on. So part of what I'm trying to say here is that there are ways of doing things better. That is where most of the energy with generative AI is going, but that's not the right way to think about it. The way to think about it is doing better things. And so these are all attempts by people who understand the limits of generative AI to try to use it to do better things in education. But Hollywood AI is what's dominating the discourse and what's dominating the advice that people are being given, whether they're corporate trainers, whether they're third-grade teachers, whether they're professors at Harvard. They're all being given a lot of what, in my point of view, is bad advice. First, that you should use, no matter what you're doing, you should use AI. AI is like a universal solvent that makes everything better, which of course we've heard before in educational technology. And second, that AI is kind of, it's like a really smart person. And so now it's like you have this really smart friend who's going to help you. Well, that is not what a large language model is. So this is from Mursion Kratky, who I really like. Mursion. She's a very, very good speaker, and she's a very, very good thinker. This is a slide from a presentation that she gave to our institute a couple weeks ago. And she talks about that we can have partnerships with this kind of alien AI that can do all this stuff. It's empathetic, and it is becoming more intelligent, and it can be autonomous and act on our behalf, and so on and so on and so on. The list is a really good list if what we have is artificial general intelligence, Hollywood AI. But that isn't what we have. What we have is the ELIZA effect on large language models. And so people think it can do all this stuff, or they say, well, it can't do it now, but it'll do it in 6 months, it'll do it next year, it'll do it, in 10 years. And $20 billion is cheap. Well, it would be cheap if you could get this, but I don't think you can. So I'm going to go back again and talk about large language models just briefly, because there's so much noise that I keep trying to find the signal and explain the signal in terms of what generative AI can and can't do. If you think about having a parrot, the first time you meet a parrot, you might be impressed by the fact that it's using language, but it doesn't take you very long to understand. It doesn't know what it's saying, and it isn't listening to know when to say it. It's really like a brain without a mind. And this is why I use that title, Complementing Human Minds with Digital Brains. The brain does a lot of really good stuff. I mean, the brain is where the natural language processing really takes place once you're familiar with the language. But it doesn't have all those things that we talked about earlier. And so there's just a whole wealth of being human, including things like being empathetic or learning or becoming more intelligent over time, that it can't do. It's a reckoning machine. And again, the training, people are really impressed. Wow, it knows the whole World Wide Web. That's kind of like saying it knows everything that's in the dump. Because all of human knowledge probably is somewhere in the World Wide Web, but finding it buried in all the other junk that's in the World Wide Web is really problematic. And it's also problematic because since it doesn't understand what you're telling it, and it's simply making reckoning judgments about what's probable, it hallucinates, it makes up citations. I had 0 cases of plagiarism in my teaching in 22 years, and then the semester that generative AI came out, and I had 2. And it wasn't malicious, but the students didn't realize that it wasn't like using a regular search engine. It would cheerfully make up citations and give you back those. And of course, if you're just looking for citations to pop into a paper without using it, which alas is what students often do, and you don't check it, then you end up with a hallucinated citation, which is in fact plagiarism. So until we can curate the training set, which is not going to happen anytime in the near future, and then every time the world changes, the whole training has to be redone, which is enormously time-consuming and expensive. I'm not talking about the little training set that you and I put on top of an LLM. I'm talking about the fundamental training of an LLM. So the perfect LLM on October 6th is useless on October 8th because you have to redo everything. And the world is changing so fast that that's not possible. So this is where I differ with the optimists, because the optimists say, and I've heard this song before in EdTech, as have you, just give us a little more time and a lot more money, and we can do this. Now, I remember when I first learned that dogs could sing, and I was really excited. Wow, dogs can sing. Who knew? Went to YouTube, sure enough, dogs were singing. But it didn't take long until I realized that dogs didn't sing very well by human standards. And I guarantee you that you could spend $10 billion in 10 years and dogs would not be giving concerts with Handel's Messiah because structurally, they're just not capable of human singing. And Rodney Brooks, in his fabulous article from 2017, The 7 Deadly Sins of AI Predictions, deadly sin number 3 is assuming that because something can be performed badly does not mean that over time it will be performed well, especially by something that's not really capable of learning. So, IA says the big impact is going to be we change the outcomes. We emphasize judgment more, we emphasize reckoning less, etc. But that's not the advice that educators are being given by us. They're being given advice that says, good, now we can increase students' test scores by giving them an AI partner. You know, now we can give students less complicated readings because really AI is going to be doing all the reading in the workplace. They just need to be able to do summaries and so on and so on. And I say to my students, when you graduate, job interviews have changed. It used to be you could have a nice chat with the interviewer about your transcript. Oh, look, it has Harvard on it. And, you know, your letters of recommendation. Now, you have to give a performance. My younger daughter graduated in mechanical engineering. And she interviewed, she was given something to debug. You graduated in marketing, you're given a bunch of materials and half an hour and told to produce the marketing plan. But of course, the interviewer is also feeding the same stuff into generative AI. And if you can't do something that's a lot better than what generative AI spits out, you're not going to get the job. Why would they hire you to do something that they can get for free? So we've got to get beyond this idea that somehow now we can faster, deeper do industrial era education, because that's not where the workplace is. And we've got to get beyond this idea that AI is somehow a wise companion that cares about you, that's going to help you learn and grow. People are wise companions, even in fan fiction with fellow students who often don't write very well. You can get more insight than from the most complicated chatbot. So substituting AI for people to help you on your journey, not a good idea unless you're helping in a way that focuses on reckoning. So the book I wrote in 2020, before generative AI, before the pandemic, actually was reinforced by both of those things, that the world is incredibly turbulent, that people are living longer even with the pandemic. They're looking at 5 to 6 careers. They've got to do self-directed lifelong learning. They need a set of not just intellectual components for that, but emotional capabilities and dispositions of different kinds that can gear them up for that world. And so the most important question that you can often ask is, what business are we? You know, Newport, Rhode Island is New Englanders. I love Newport. Go down and look at the mansions. Over a century ago, those were built during what Mark Twain called the Gilded Age. And the railroad fortunes and the banking fortunes led a small group of Americans to live like kings and queens. But within 20 years, those fortunes had collapsed. The mansions were largely torn down. A few were left as museums. Gone with the wind. Why did they collapse? The people didn't know what business they were in. They thought they were in the railroad business, but they were actually in the transportation business. And the automobile and the airplane hammered the railroad. We're not in the education business anymore. We're not in the course business, the classroom business, the campus business, the degree business, none of that. We're in the lifelong learning business. And the sooner we figure that out, and the sooner we create self-directed adults, rich in judgment skills, who can navigate this horrendous half century that we're looking down the barrel of, the better. So that's my 2 cents about AI, at least at this point in my thinking. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Fascinating. So we can take questions at this point, and people online, you can post questions in the chat, but just raise your hand and unmute.
Questions, comments, rebuttal, whatever you want to throw. Yes.
So part of this flexibility, I think, is sense making, but you bring baggage, good or bad, and that's a judgment either on your part or my part of whether I'm biased to the good or biased to the bad. And as we've evolved, like if you look at a model of chats, people narrow their focus and sort of accumulate around their comfort zone of tasks. And so instead of opening up possibility and flexibility, I see inflexibility being reinforced with the tools given to us in this digital age. How do you address that? And can AI address that?
So first, I think that you've just given a really good summary of the downside of social media. Because social media has done a lot of good things. And I wrote a book chapter where I talked about top-down knowledge, like encyclopedias, and bottom-up knowledge, like people's collective understanding of some event that they were part of or that they can resonate with in some way. And where those two types of knowledge meet is potentially very powerful. But the downside of social media, and this is my interpretation of what you were saying, each of us now can create our own reality and put a firewall around that so that nothing gets through that distorts that alternate reality. And when people live in completely different realities, they start arguing about things that are factual, because what's a fact in the real world may not be a fact in an alternate reality. And that's been enormously destructive. I mean, that's the worst thing that could come out of social media. And for all of the problems with broadcast media, at least you have to listen to things that you didn't filter that introduce an alternative thing into your little carefully crafted bubble of alternate reality around you. So how we kind of reverse that process is hard, because again, it's not something that we're wired for. The literature shows that if you desegregate and then you say, good, done, the neighborhood resegregates. Because people like to hang with people who look like them, who think like them, who act like them. Human nature. So how do we become xenophilic rather than xenophobic? AI can't really help with that. I mean, that's a kind of overcoming your neurological life, and it's really overcoming your animal brain is what it boils down to. That there was a time when it was safer to be with people that look like you, but that isn't the case anymore. You're actually better off being with people who aren't like you at all, so that you can learn from them. How do we get there? Not clear. I don't know that AI has anything that can help with that, but I'm curious about that institute that's doing cross-cultural narrative. If it can help, if AI can be some part of that, then I think it might be able to. Yes.
Chris, are you a fan of Dune?
Sure.
Okay. So Dune, where Dune starts is way after the Butlerian Jihad, which is a time in which computers did more and more, and more control, and actually enslaved humans. Mm-hmm. So that's part of our culture now, that saga. So do you think that, I mean, that is a worry that people have, that computers will have more and more control, not that they're just going to be smarter. as we hand over control to intelligent machines.
So let's again talk about the difference between generative AI and artificial general intelligence. Artificial general intelligence is like Hollywood AI in the sense that it wouldn't just reflect things back to you. It would have internal consciousness, it would have internal drives of different kinds. It would have the ability to act spontaneously and so on. It's really difficult to know what that would mean. And in science fiction, you can find different genres where AGI is benevolent, AGI tries to take over, AGI says, the hell with this, and goes somewhere else and leaves human beings on their own, whatever. All sorts of permutations. What I will say is that the threat from, I think the undiscovered threat from generative AI is actually different. Generative AI doesn't have, desire. So it can't desire power. If you turn generative AI, if you told generative AI you were going to unplug every generative AI in the world, it wouldn't even understand what you meant. So it wouldn't be able to respond and say, oh, no, you're not. But if you think of sunlight and moonlight, Shakespeare said the moon is a thief. She steals her light from the sun, which is true. Moonlight is reflected, it's not generated. Generative AI actually depends on the World Wide Web or whatever you feed into it, which has been human. And so you can think of generative AI as kind of like moonlight. It takes in sunlight and it reflects back moonlight. And I like moonlight, but to beat the metaphor to death, moonlight doesn't support the water cycle, right? Moonlight doesn't support photosynthesis. And now the really dangerous thing that we're doing is we're cluttering up the World Wide Web with lots of generative AI products. So now we're training it on sunlight plus moonlight. And eventually, if we train it on enough moonlight, it's going to degrade. And then we will, in a sense, we will have undercut ourselves by accident. So that's the part that really does me.
So we have thank you. So we have a question in the online. So Vanessa, if you want to unmute and ask your question, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So hi. You touched on it briefly before, but all of these companies are throwing vast amounts of money at making generative AI and so on more powerful. And you've talked about all the cycles that have happened in the past, all of the hubris people have had with their grand predictions on what AI will or won't do. Are they all just chasing the wind at this point? Like, has the crest of the initial success kind of passed and just all the investors haven't noticed yet? What are you thinking we are in that hype cycle? Is it continuing to flow, or are we kind of in the ebb and now dealing with the consequences?
Well, it's hard to forecast. First, I don't have any special knowledge, but my instinct is two things. One of them is the companies are they're not selling a complete con. The ability to have natural language processing is a big deal. And a lot of people in AI, including me and my institute, are excited about that. And we're working to try to make a difference with it. And the ability to understand natural language unlocks IA, which again could be a big deal, but only if people upskill. And it's potentially valuable. Where the hype comes in is claiming that this is artificial general intelligence or some kind of a threshold to artificial general intelligence, and that we're going to be able to do all the things on that list that I showed earlier, relatively quickly. That is, in my belief, a con. I kind of tested that last week because I convened 40 members of my institute, the institute I work with, I should say. And I would say that 35 of the 40 were technical experts in AI. So they were people who worked in AI for a while, who really understand it technically. And I asked this sort of, we had an hour discussion on Gen AI versus AGI. There was only one of the 40 people who believed that we were going towards AGI in the near future. Most of the people agreed, formulating it each in their own way, that large language models are a platform for moving forward, but they're not an evolving advance. They're just sort of a step on the staircase. So I think that means that within a couple years, even though the companies have spent a lot of money on marketing and on embedding it into everything, so that you can't even open a document without getting a message that says, why don't you use AI? That what they're going to find is that there isn't the market uptake that they want to have, because people are trying it and they're finding that it isn't all that wonderful or useful, that after a while, it all seems very banal and commonplace and one size fits all. So I'm hoping that the hype cycle will start to recede in the next year or two, but will it? Or will the generative AI people pull something out of the hat that nobody is anticipating? Hard to say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So there's reading through a whole bunch of the literature on AI and learning, et cetera. What a lot of people did not, and maybe do not realize, is that it's only good up till about 2022, and I'm sure that's starting to change. But that's the most recent information. But given that, there's this panic on a continuum in the education world of, absolutely forbidden to use in schools because we don't know anything about this, to, yeah, bring it. I'm doing everything with AI. So what needs to happen in school systems, in districts, to create a responsible comfort level, but also an informed comfort level to be able to, maybe incorporate some of this into learning for kids?
Well, I think that as usual, part of the problem is that educators are getting the dumbed down version of all of this. So they're getting the Cliff Notes version of what generative AI is, not even the Reader's Digest version, let alone, the unadulterated literature. And one of the things that I tried to model, even in something like a blog post, is having citations to primary source material, so that if you want, you can go and look at the original scholarly article. And while some of those articles are highly technical, and I struggle to make sense of them, there are other scholarly articles that are written in a way that I think would be accessible to somebody that has a teaching certificate, if they spend a little time and energy, and then they can draw their own conclusions about it. They're not taking my word for it, or the U.S. Department of Education's word for it, or Khan Academy's word for it. They can make up their own minds. So I think the first thing that needs to happen is we need to stop treating educators as if baby talk was the only thing that they could handle, and really give them, curated, accurate resources from which they can make their judgments. The second thing I think is that this idea that if it interferes with the journey, it's not a good educational advance, is pretty simple to apply. It's kind of common sense, really, when you think about it. And I think a lot of educators can sort that out and say, if something gives feedback on summaries my students are are writing, and I think the feedback is good because I've compared myself to it, well and good. If something is writing the summaries and then asking the students to give feedback on them, that's a bad idea, even though it sounds kind of similar. So I think really we need to trust educators more and give them what they need. And with parents, and I've done some similar presentations in this to parents, the message is what's needed to succeed at the workplace has transformed. This is a teaching at the workplace because of IA. And don't think that your child with perfect 800 high stakes test scores and beautifully written 5-paragraph descriptive essays with openings and closings that match the College Board templates is going to do well in life. They're not. They're going to do badly because you're teaching them to be a bad AI rather than a skillful human being. So I think parents and teachers both need to be getting information that basically says, don't do things better, do better things.
Thank you. We have a comment in the chat, and then I'll get to you, Vanessa. This is from Chen. A lot of enthusiasm about Gen AI is, oh, we can make learning faster now. But with the speed of AI, our mental clock for learning will recalibrate and be more rushed. The questions are, one, what do we do with so much extra time? But maybe the right question to ask is, two, how can we make learning slow again to adapt to the human mind?
Well, I'm like you, I'm very skeptical about claiming that somehow we can change the nature of learning by using AI. And I'm reminded of the long history of people who claimed that you could learn in your sleep. And it all makes sense until you try to do it. And then you find that it doesn't work that way. But there's this sort of magic, that somehow AI is going to change the clock inside of your head for cognitive processing, and somehow you're going to learn faster or something. What we know about learning is that it varies a lot from person to person and how it works, and that it takes time and effort. And what we need to do is to respect that. But there are types of learning that we don't have to do anymore. And that is where the real savings is. I remember when I was in 3rd grade, I was the fastest in my class at doing arithmetic worksheets. I could crank them out faster than anybody else, and I was more accurate than any of the other students. And the teacher and I didn't realize that now a $3 solar calculator can run rings around me. So what on earth was I doing with that kind of proficiency? And the same kind of question can be asked about huge chunks of the curriculum. So thinking about performance assessments that match the kinds of performances that people need to do in life, thinking about respecting that understanding takes time and effort, but that there are things that you can now take out of the curriculum that are wasting people's time and effort that might give you that bandwidth. I think that that's where we need to be going.
Thank you. And I think we can take one more question. And Vanessa, go ahead.
Sure. Thinking about judgment against reckoning, there's two different processes, and the kind of what you were just talking about of kind of making parts of the curriculum kind of obsolete. Trying to get more judgment in the process. Like, I feel like there's been a lot of debate about, say, standardized testing, and I guess part of my hope is that with AI, that becomes kind of pointless. Like, yeah, as you say, training people to be bad AIs. One thing that kind of came up in my thinking there was the hallucination concept. Would it be possible for, as people come to understand these limits, the prevalence of hallucinations to actually improve people's creative thinking because, you know, in the past, like Google might show you nothing, but it's kind of new for those things to actually lie to you and you have to actually detect it. Like when I was in high school about 10 years ago, Wikipedia was first starting to be a big thing, and teachers would always tell us, Wikipedia is not a reliable source. You can't cite it in your papers. And we would say, why? What? You a Luddite? And but they explained that because there's nothing original on there. It's all from the stuff that it's cited on. So you have to go to those. And like my hope is that with AI, people will and in this case, like realize that even if it has a citation, that citation might be nothing. It might be pulled out of nothing. And I wonder if that might help break down some of these alternate realities that social media has given us all to live in, get people a little more leveled up in their critical thinking as they come to realize that these things aren't as smart as they pretend to be.
I'm hoping that that will take place. And I think the example that I gave about job interviews is a possible incentive. What if you ask ChatGPT to do something that's a production for the workplace, like a marketing plan? What you'll get is kind of a B- to C+ marketing plan. And the business that produces nothing but that because it's gotten rid of its marketing experts and is going to save money using ChatGPT is not going to fare well against companies that have kept their marketing experts, even at additional expense, and are doing creative kinds of marketing that work. The Super Bowl commercials are a nice example of this. Did you see the commercial where the cat says mayo? There's a commercial where the cat, the woman is trying to make a quick dinner, and she's in despair because she can't find anything in her refrigerator that looks edible, and the cat says mayo, and oh my, the cat can talk, and there's this nice 1 minute, you know, sort of mayo related rise and fall of the cat. That's a concept that you could feed prompts into ChatGPT till the cows come home, and you never would have gotten that, you know, as a skilled human being thinks of it. Now, of course, because we polluted the training set, ChatGPT can generate that. But that's the driver, it seems to me, that if you really want to get a good job, you've got to go into there better than what AI can do.
Makes sense. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Chris. Thank you for everybody online. We will post this on our YouTube channel once we get the recording. So thank you, people online. We'll be shutting you off now. And for those that are here, we have pizza and snacks.